I am Jordan, 31 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful real estate developer, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale dinner to catch up. Between expensive wine and appetizers, my sister announced she was expecting her seventh child. My mother leaned forward, smirking. "You know, Jordan, you need to move out of your little rental. Whitney needs you in her basement to cook and clean for her kids." I simply sipped my water and smiled. I said absolutely not. My brother-in-law snapped that I had no family, and this was my training. I left without another word. The next morning, the police called about a stolen identity. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The crystal chandeliers at the French Quarter restaurant sparkled, casting a warm, arrogant glow over our private dining table. This was exactly the kind of upscale place my mother Brenda loved to frequent. She thrived on the performative aspect of wealth, the crisp white tablecloths, the expensive silverware, the servers hovering anxiously nearby. To her, nothing mattered more than projecting an image of absolute perfection, especially to her friends on the community church board. My father Calvin sat at the head of the table, radiating his usual patriarchal authority. Across from me sat my older sister Whitney and her husband Preston. Whitney wore a tailored maternity dress that looked brand new, her posture radiating the entitlement she had been fed since childhood. Preston, a 36-year-old white man who constantly bragged about his career as a financial advisor, sat beside her with his signature smug expression. I sat quietly at the end of the table, wearing a simple black dress, nursing a glass of sparkling water. To them, I was just Jordan, the 31-year-old spinster who cleaned houses for a living. They had absolutely no idea that I was the founder and chief executive officer of a highly successful property technology firm. I kept my life strictly private because sharing anything with my family only invited extreme ridicule or endless demands for money. Whitney tapped her silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute, demanding the attention of the entire room. Everyone quieted down as she stood up, placing a perfectly manicured hand over her slightly rounded stomach. "Preston and I have an amazing announcement," she declared, her voice carrying that familiar tone of absolute superiority. "We are officially expecting baby number 7. My parents erupted into applause. My father Calvin beamed with pride, slamming his hand on the table in joy. "Great job, sweetheart," he boomed. "You are truly building a beautiful family. We are so incredibly proud of you." My mother, Brenda, wiped a dramatic fake tear from her eye. 7 beautiful blessings, she gushed, looking around to ensure the other patrons were watching our happy family display. "You are the perfect example of a devoted mother, Whitney. The church board will be so thrilled to hear the news on Sunday." I offered a polite smile and a quiet congratulations. I had no ill will toward my nieces and nephews, but I knew exactly what a new baby meant for Whitney and Preston. It meant more chaos, more demands for money from my parents, and more expectations placed on everyone else to cater to their growing household. As the applause died down, the atmosphere at the table shifted abruptly. My mother Brenda turned her attention directly to me. The warm, adoring smile she had just given Whitney vanished completely, replaced by a hard, calculating stare. "Jordan," she said, her voice dropping its sweet tone and taking on the sharp edge of a command. "We need to discuss your living situation." I set my water glass down slowly, feeling a familiar knot of tension form in my stomach. "What about my living situation, Mom?" I asked, keeping my face perfectly neutral. "You need to move out of your little rental at the end of the month," she stated flatly, not asking a question but delivering a direct order. "Whitney is going to need full-time help with the new baby coming, and the other 6 kids running around. Preston is traveling constantly for his financial firm now. You will pack your things and move into Whitney's basement apartment. You will handle the cooking, the cleaning, and managing the kids full-time so your sister can rest properly." I stared at her, trying to process the sheer audacity of her demand. She was not suggesting I help out on weekends. She was ordering me to abandon my entire life to become a live-in maid and nanny for my sister. I looked at my father, expecting him to intervene to say that was completely unreasonable. Instead, Calvin nodded in agreement, his arms crossed over his chest. Your mother is right, Jordan. You have no real responsibilities tying you down. It is time you stepped up and contributed to this family. Whitney leaned back in her chair, looking incredibly pleased with herself. Do not worry, Jordan, she added with a condescending smile. I will let you eat whatever groceries I buy, and you will not have to pay rent for the basement. It is a very generous setup for someone in your position. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I looked at the four of them, seeing the absolute conviction in their eyes. They genuinely believed I was a failure, a woman with no value beyond what physical labor I could provide to the golden child. They thought because they believed I scrubbed toilets for a living that my time and my freedom were completely worthless. I am not moving anywhere, I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. And I am absolutely not becoming a full-time nanny and maid for Whitney. The answer is no. My mother gasped, clutching her pearl necklace as if I had just physically struck her. Jordan. Marie. How dare you speak to us with such disrespect? Your sister is carrying a child. I do not care if she is carrying royalty. Mom, I replied, refusing to break eye contact. I have my own life, my own career, and my own home. I am not giving up my independence to raise children I did not create. That was when Preston decided to interject. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. He always had a way of speaking to me that dripped with microaggressions, a subtle daily reminder that he viewed me as fundamentally beneath him. Come on, Jordan, he said, using that smooth salesman voice he probably used to scam his clients. Let us be realistic here. You are 31 years old and single. You scrub baseboards and clean other people's houses for a living. You should be down on your knees feeling grateful to experience what a real family looks like. I felt a cold fury rising in my chest, but I kept my face entirely impassive. Preston was not finished. Plus, he added, gesturing vaguely with his hand, my gated community is much safer for someone like you. We all know the kind of dangerous neighborhoods you can afford on a cleaner salary. You will have a safe roof over your head, and you can finally do something useful with your time instead of struggling to make rent every month. Consider it your training for if you ever manage to find a husband. The sheer racism and classism layered in his words made the air in my lungs turn to ice. He sat there, a privileged white man dripping in fake wealth, looking down at a black woman he assumed was impoverished and desperate, telling me I should be grateful to serve him. My father, Calvin, nodded in agreement. Preston makes a very valid point, Jordan. You are throwing away a perfectly good opportunity to live in a respectable area. You are being selfish and stubborn, just like you have always been since you were a little girl. Selfish. I repeated the word, tasting bitter and metallic on my tongue. I slowly stood up from my chair, picking up my cloth napkin. I am selfish. I tossed the napkin onto my empty dinner plate and looked directly at my father. Just like I was supposed to be grateful when you and Mom manipulated me into signing away my college fund. I asked, my voice cutting sharply through the ambient noise of the restaurant. My father's face instantly hardened. My mother looked around nervously, hoping no one at the neighboring tables had heard my rising tone. Do not bring the past into this, Brenda hissed, her eyes darting frantically toward a nearby waiter. Oh, we are bringing it into this, I said, refusing to lower my voice or sit back down. You drained $50,000 out of the college account my grandmother left me just so you could pay for Whitney's luxurious destination wedding in Tulum. You told me it was a family emergency that you would pay me back. You never did. I had to work 3 miserable jobs and take out predatory loans just to pay for my basic classes at the community college. Whitney rolled her eyes, letting out an exaggerated theatrical sigh. God, you are so dramatic, Jordan. That was years ago. I needed a beautiful wedding and you were barely passing your classes anyway. It was an investment in the family image. An investment, I scoffed, turning my cold gaze toward Preston. Is that what you call it, Preston? Is that the kind of brilliant financial advice you give your clients? Steal from your family to fund a beach party. Watch your mouth. Preston warned, his smirk finally disappearing, replaced by a flash of genuine anger. You do not know anything about finance or investments. You are a cleaner. Stick to what you know. I know enough to recognize a parasite when I see one, I shot back. I looked at my parents, their faces tight with fury and embarrassment. You want me to give up my life to serve Whitney? You want me to clean your house and raise your children for free because you think my time has zero value? You think I am nothing. But I am not your slave, and I am definitely not your safety net. Jordan Calvin growled, half rising from his chair, his fists clenched. You sit down right now and apologize to your sister and your brother-in-law. You are embarrassing us in public. I am not apologizing for telling the truth, I said, grabbing my purse from the back of the chair. You can hire a nanny, Preston. If you are such a successful financial advisor, paying for full-time childcare should be pocket change for you. Unless, of course, you are completely broke. Preston's face flushed a deep, angry red. He opened his mouth to speak, but I did not give him the chance to formulate a lie. Enjoy your dinner, I said, looking at my mother. Have fun explaining to the church board why your youngest daughter walked out on your perfect family performance. I turned on my heel and walked away. I could hear my father calling my name, demanding I come back, but I did not stop. I walked through the elegant dining room, past the staring patrons, and out the heavy glass doors into the cool evening air. The valet brought my car around, and I handed him a generous tip before sliding into the driver's seat. As I drove away from the restaurant, my hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The anger was still burning hot in my chest, but beneath it was a profound sense of relief. I had finally said the words I had been holding back for years. I had finally drawn a hard line in the sand. When I arrived back at my home, I did not pull into a shabby rental unit in a dangerous neighborhood. I pulled into the private underground parking garage of a luxury high-rise building in the most exclusive part of the city. I swiped my key fob and took the private elevator directly up to my penthouse apartment. I walked into the massive living room, dropping my purse on the custom marble kitchen island. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city skyline. This was the life I had built for myself, a life of immense wealth, security, and total independence. I was the chief executive officer of a highly profitable property technology firm that was currently acquiring commercial real estate across the entire state. My net worth was something my parents and Preston could not even begin to comprehend. I poured myself a glass of expensive red wine and walked out onto the balcony, letting the cool wind wash over my face. I thought about the absolute arrogance of my family. They were so blinded by their own prejudices and their obsession with image that they never bothered to look past the surface. They assumed that because I did not flaunt designer labels or talk loudly about money like Preston did, that I must be failing. They wanted me to be failing so they could feel superior. I drank my wine and looked out at the city lights. Tomorrow was Monday. A new week, a new slate of board meetings and property acquisitions. I resolved to put the terrible dinner behind me and focus entirely on my business. I was completely done letting them dictate my emotions. I would cut contact and move forward with my peace. But peace was the absolute last thing waiting for me. I woke up the next morning feeling refreshed and ready to tackle the day. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale, golden light across my spacious bedroom. I reached over to my nightstand to turn off my alarm. It was exactly 6:00 in the morning. As my fingers brushed the screen, the phone suddenly began to vibrate violently in my hand. It was an incoming call from an unknown number. I frowned, staring at the screen. I rarely received calls this early unless it was a major emergency at one of my commercial properties. I slid my thumb across the glass and answered, bringing the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice rough with sleep. "Good morning, am I speaking with Jordan Marie Williams?" A stern male voice asked on the other end of the line. "Yes, this is she," I replied, sitting up in bed and pulling the duvet around my shoulders. "Who is calling?" "Ma'am. This is Officer Carter from the Financial Crimes Unit at the Metropolitan Police Department," the voice stated officially. "I apologize for calling so early, but we have an urgent situation that requires your immediate attention." My heart skipped a beat. A cold wave of adrenaline washed over my body, instantly clearing away any remaining sleepiness. Financial Crimes Unit. My mind raced through a dozen different scenarios. Had one of my corporate accounts been compromised? Had a wire transfer been intercepted? What kind of situation, Officer Carter? I asked, swinging my legs over the side of the bed and planting my feet firmly on the hardwood floor. We received a flag from a major lending institution. Overnight, he explained, his tone serious and measured. Ma'am, someone used your full name and your social security number to take out a $150,000 personal loan late last night. The funds were approved and set for immediate transfer. I stood up, my hand gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. $150,000. Someone had stolen my identity. Are you absolutely certain? I asked, pacing toward the large windows. I did not authorize any loans. My credit is locked. How did this happen? That is why we are contacting you, Officer Carter said. The security protocols at the bank flagged the transaction because of the digital footprint and a strange discrepancy in the employment verification. We halted the transfer just in time. But that is not all, ma'am. What else? I demanded, my pulse hammering violently against my ribs. The application was finalized in person at a 24-hour automated kiosk terminal before it was pushed through the online portal, he continued. We pulled the security footage from the kiosk camera immediately. We have clear visual evidence of the individual who used your social security number and forged your signature. I stopped pacing. Who was it? Do you have an identification? Yes, ma'am, Officer Carter said. Based on the footage and the destination account details linked to the loan, we have identified the suspect. He paused for a fraction of a second, and when he spoke again, his words completely shattered my reality. The suspect is a white male named Preston. He listed himself as your financial advisor and brother-in-law. We need you to come down to the precinct immediately to verify the footage and file formal charges. I told Officer Carter I would be down there in 20 minutes. I ended the call and stood in the center of my bedroom. The quiet luxury of my penthouse felt completely at odds with the violent pounding in my chest. Preston had actually stolen my identity. The arrogant, smug man who sat across from me at dinner, insulting my livelihood and demanding my servitude, had spent his evening committing federal fraud in my name. I dressed quickly, pulling on a simple tailored suit, and grabbed my keys. I did not take the company car. I took the unassuming sedan I kept for running quiet errands. I needed to keep my reality hidden for just a little longer. The precinct was a stark contrast to my usual mornings. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale glow over the worn linoleum floors and crowded desks. Officer Carter was waiting for me near the front. He led me into a small, windowless room and gestured to a chair opposite his desk. He turned his computer monitor so I could see the screen. He clicked a button and a grainy security video began to play. It was a 24-hour automated banking kiosk located in a wealthy suburb not far from where Preston and Whitney lived. The timestamp read 1 in the morning. A man stepped into the frame wearing a familiar designer trench coat with the collar turned up. He kept his head tilted down, but when he reached for the touchscreen, the camera caught his face perfectly. It was Preston. His usual arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a frantic, sweaty desperation. He inputted the information, Carter explained, pausing the video as Preston typed on the screen. He used your full name, your date of birth, and your social security number. He attempted to secure a personal loan of $150,000 to be wired immediately to an offshore holding account. We have seen this specific account flagged in other investigations. It is usually a blind drop used to cover massive financial deficits. Why was it stopped? I asked, leaning forward to look closer at Preston's panicked expression. Officer Carter gave me a curious look. Your financial profile flagged it immediately. Most victims of identity theft do not find out until the money is gone and their credit is destroyed. But your social security number is attached to a highly secure wealth management firm. The system detected an anomaly because the income listed on the fraudulent application did not match your actual tax bracket. Furthermore, your credit score is virtually flawless. The bank required secondary biometric verification to release funds of that magnitude for a profile like yours. When he could not provide it, the system locked down and alerted our fraud division. Preston thought I was an easy target, I said, my voice dangerously calm. He thought I was just a struggling house cleaner living paycheck to paycheck. He assumed I would not have credit monitoring or any banking safeguards. He thought he could saddle me with a massive debt, and I would never have the resources to fight back. Officer Carter nodded, closing the video file. That is the standard profile for these types of familial crimes. The perpetrator targets a relative they believe lacks the financial literacy or legal resources to defend themselves. He made a massive miscalculation with you. I pulled out my phone. I need to make a call to my lead attorney, I told him. I want to press full charges. I want every piece of documentation you have sent to my legal team. I dialed Marcus, the head of my corporate legal department. I kept my voice low, explaining the situation rapidly. Marcus was immediately on it. He assured me he would coordinate with the precinct to lock down the fraudulent application permanently and ensure my assets remained impenetrable. He also promised to start building a comprehensive profile on Preston's financial activities. If Preston was desperate enough to commit identity theft for $150,000, he was likely hiding something much bigger. Before I left the precinct, Officer Carter handed me a printed color still from the security footage. It showed Preston's face clearly illuminated by the kiosk screen. I took the photo and slid it into my purse. I knew exactly where I needed to go next. I drove to my parents' house in the suburbs. It was the same immaculate colonial-style home I had grown up in. The lawn was perfectly manicured, the hedges trimmed with mathematical precision. My mother, Brenda, maintained the exterior of the house as a physical representation of our family status. Everything had to look pristine for the neighbors and the church congregation, regardless of the rot hiding behind the front door. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The smell of expensive vanilla candles and fresh coffee filled the air. I found my parents in the formal dining room. My father, Calvin, was sitting at the head of the table reading a business journal. My mother, Brenda, was sipping coffee from a delicate porcelain cup. They looked so peaceful, so perfectly comfortable in their manufactured reality. Jordan, my mother said, her pleasant expression vanishing the second she saw me. What are you doing here so early? Did you come to your senses about moving in with Whitney? We were just discussing how selfish you acted at dinner last night. I did not say a word. I walked straight to the table, reached into my purse, and pulled out the security photograph. I dropped it directly onto the polished mahogany wood right in front of my father. Look at it, I said. Calvin frowned, adjusting his reading glasses. He picked up the photograph and studied it. Brenda leaned over his shoulder, her brow furrowing in confusion. What is this? Brenda asked. It is Preston at a bank. Why do you have this? That is security footage from 1 a.m, I explained, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. Preston went to an automated kiosk and used my social security number to forge a loan application. He tried to steal $150,000 in my name. The police intercepted it because my credit monitoring caught the fraud. I just came from the precinct. The silence in the dining room was absolute. I watched my parents' faces, waiting for the shock to set in. I waited for the outrage. I waited for my father to stand up and declare that he would protect his daughter from a criminal. I waited for my mother to express horror that her son-in-law had tried to ruin my life. Instead, Calvin slowly lowered the photograph back onto the table. He took off his reading glasses and looked at me. His expression was not angry at Preston. His expression was furious with me. You went to the police? Calvin asked, his voice dangerously low. They called me, I corrected him. Because he committed a federal crime, Dad. He stole my identity. Calvin stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the floor. Before I could even register his movement, he raised his hand and slapped me hard across the face. The sound cracked like a whip in the quiet room. My head snapped to the side, the sting of the impact radiating through my cheek and jaw. I stumbled back a step, bringing my hand up to my face. I stared at him, entirely paralyzed by the sudden physical violence. My father had been emotionally cruel my entire life, but he had not struck me since I was a teenager. Are you trying to destroy this family? Calvin roared, his face turning a deep shade of purple. Are you trying to send your sister's husband to jail? Do you have any idea what you are doing? He stole from me, I yelled back, the shock dissolving into pure white-hot anger. He committed a felony. He is a respected white man in finance, Calvin shouted, stepping toward me, pointing a trembling finger in my face. Do you know what his presence does for this family? Do you know the kind of doors he opens for us in this community? He elevates our status. You want to drag his name through the mud and send him to federal prison over a misunderstanding. Do you know how bad this makes us look to the church board? Do you know the humiliation you will bring down on our heads? A misunderstanding, I repeated, feeling sick to my stomach. He tried to saddle me with $150,000 of debt. He tried to ruin my future. You do not have a future, Brenda suddenly chimed in, slamming her coffee cup down. She stood up, moving to stand beside my father, a united front against me. You clean baseboards, Jordan. You have nothing to lose. Whitney is pregnant with her seventh child. She needs her husband. She needs a provider. You know how hard Preston works to maintain their lifestyle in that gated community. He is under a lot of pressure. He probably just needed a short-term bridge loan to cover an investment gap, and he knew you would not understand the complex world of finance. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, completely entirely repulsed by her words. You are defending him. You are defending a man who committed fraud because you care more about having a wealthy white son-in-law to brag about than you care about your own daughter's survival. You have nothing but a mop and a bucket, Brenda said, her voice dripping with vicious contempt. Preston provides for this family. He gives us respectable grandchildren. You will call those police officers right now and you will withdraw the complaint. You will tell them it was a mix-up. Calvin stepped closer, leaning over the table. You are going to do exactly what your mother says, Jordan. You will drop the charges immediately. And then you are going to call the bank and you are going to legally co-sign that loan for him. I felt all the breath leave my lungs. I looked at my father to see if he was joking. He was completely serious. You want me to co-sign the fraudulent loan? I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. It is just $150,000, Calvin said, waving his hand as if dismissing a trivial detail. You can work extra shifts at your little cleaning company. You can take on more clients. Preston needs that money to fix whatever financial issue he is dealing with, and he cannot have a criminal record. If he goes to prison, Whitney will have nothing. You will take responsibility for the loan to protect your sister. They really believed it. They genuinely believed I was a struggling maid, and they were entirely willing to force me into a lifetime of crushing debt just to protect the image of the golden child and her fraudulent husband. They wanted me to scrub floors until my hands bled just to keep Preston out of a jail cell. They viewed my entire existence as nothing more than a sacrifice meant to be burned at the altar of Whitney's perfect life. I lowered my hand from my stinging cheek. I stood up perfectly straight, squaring my shoulders. I looked at the two strangers standing in front of me, and I let out a short, bitter laugh. The sheer absurdity of the situation finally broke through the pain. I am not withdrawing the complaint, I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. I am not calling the police. I am not co-signing a dime for that parasite. Preston made his choice, and now he is going to face the federal consequences. And if you two try to interfere, I will make sure the police know you attempted to intimidate a witness. Calvin slammed his fist on the table. If you walk out that door and let him go to jail, I will disown you, Jordan. You will be dead to this family. I looked at him without a shred of fear. You disowned me the day you stole my college fund to pay for a party, I said. You do not have a daughter anymore, Calvin. You just have a scapegoat, and I am officially resigning from the position. I turned around and walked out of the dining room. I did not look back as Brenda started screaming my name, demanding I come back and show respect. I walked out the front door, down the pristine walkway, and got into my car. I locked the doors and started the engine, the adrenaline making my hands shake slightly on the steering wheel. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the suburban nightmare. I had barely made it 2 blocks down the street when my phone buzzed in the cup holder. The screen lit up with a notification from the family group chat. I merged onto the main road and glanced down at the screen. Whitney had just posted a message. Below her text was a photograph of a legal document. I tapped the screen at the red light to open the image. It was a formal cease and desist order, drafted on heavy legal letterhead from Preston's supposed financial firm. I read the message Whitney had typed underneath the photograph, and a cold smile slowly spread across my face. If you do not drop the absurd charges against my husband and get your bags packed for my basement by Friday, we are suing you into bankruptcy. Whitney wrote, her words radiating toxic entitlement. Your pathetic little cleaning company is illegally using Preston's trademarked logos on your supplies. We have the legal paperwork to prove it. You mess with my family, Jordan, I destroy your life. Have fun paying legal fees on a maid's salary. The light turned green. I pressed my foot on the gas, accelerating toward the city. Whitney and Preston thought they could scare a maid with a fake lawsuit. They had no idea they had just declared war on a multimillionaire with a legal team that could buy and sell Preston's entire existence before lunchtime. I stared at the image on my phone screen for a long time. A fake cease and desist order sent via a family group chat. Whitney actually believed a fabricated legal threat would force me into her basement to change diapers. The document claimed my so-called pathetic cleaning business was infringing on Preston's trademarked corporate logos. It was a laughable intimidation tactic meant to bully a desperate maid. They had no idea I did not own a cleaning service. I owned Vanguard Real Estate and Technology, a firm that managed billions in assets. My legal team could crush Preston's fake financial firm before my morning coffee got cold. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. Let them try to sue a phantom cleaning lady. I had a $12 million commercial acquisition to close today. I arrived at Vanguard Tower, a sleek glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of the financial district. My company owned the top 3 floors. The lobby was a masterpiece of imported marble and modern art, echoing with the quiet hum of serious wealth. I was in the middle of a high-stakes walkthrough with Marcus Sterling, a billionaire developer who is partnering with my firm on a massive urban revitalization project. We were finalizing the contract details as we stepped into the private penthouse elevator. Down in the lobby, the pristine atmosphere was about to be violently shattered. As the glass elevator descended toward the ground floor, I heard the commotion before I even saw it. A shrill, hysterical voice echoed off the marble walls. I recognized that voice immediately. It was my mother, Brenda. "I demand to speak to the building manager right now!" Brenda shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at the stunned concierge behind the front desk. "My daughter works here as a cleaner, and she is a thief. We have legal documents. We are not leaving until you drag her down here and fire her." Standing right beside her was Whitney, heavily pregnant and holding up a manila folder like it was a weapon. Whitney sneered at the security guards who were quickly approaching. "Do not touch me," Whitney snapped. "My husband is a top-tier financial advisor. We are here to serve legal papers to one of your janitorial staff. Her name is Jordan. Call her supervisor immediately. She stole corporate property, and we are going to make sure she never scrubs another toilet in this city." The sheer embarrassment of their public tantrum would have mortified the old me. The old Jordan would have panicked, trying to quiet them down, begging them not to ruin her livelihood. But standing in the glass elevator, watching them behave like feral animals in my building, I felt nothing but a cold, detached amusement. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they did not even pause to wonder why a maid would be summoned to a Class A commercial building for a trademark dispute. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. Marcus and I stepped out into the lobby. I was wearing a tailored designer's suit, holding a leather portfolio containing the $12 million contract we had just agreed upon. Marcus turned to me, shaking my hand with profound respect. "Jordan, it is an absolute pleasure doing business with you," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet lobby. "Your vision for this property portfolio is unmatched. We will wire the initial funds by noon." I smiled warmly at him. "Thank you, Marcus. My team will handle the transition seamlessly." Before I could finish my sentence, Whitney spotted me. Her eyes locked onto the leather portfolio in my hands. Her brain, entirely incapable of processing me as a corporate equal, immediately jumped to the most degrading conclusion possible. "There she is!" Whitney yelled, marching across the marble floor with our mother trailing right behind her. "Look at you playing dress-up. Did your boss make you carry his important papers to the lobby? How pathetic." Marcus stopped and frowned, looking back and forth between me and the two unhinged women storming toward us. "Jordan, do you know these people?" he asked, his tone laced with confusion. Unfortunately, I replied, my voice completely flat. Brenda shoved her way past Whitney, planting her hands on her hips. "Do not you dare ignore us, Jordan. You are going to drop those papers right now and march your behind over here. Preston filed the lawsuit this morning. You are going to sign a confession admitting you stole his logos for your little cleaning business, or we are going to the police. And then you are moving your things into Whitney's basement just like we told you." I looked at my mother. I looked at my sister. They were standing in my building, threatening my non-existent cleaning job, demanding I surrender my entire life to them. Whitney waved the manila folder in my face. "You thought you could just walk out of dinner and embarrass us. Preston said he would teach you a lesson, and he did. Sign the papers, Jordan. Admit you are a thief, or you will be scrubbing prison floors instead of office buildings." I slowly turned to Marcus, who was watching the exchange with undisguised horror. "Marcus, I apologize for the interruption," I said, my voice projecting a calm authority that made Whitney flinch. "My security team will handle these trespassers. Have a wonderful afternoon." Marcus nodded quickly, stepping around my mother. "I will call your office later, Jordan." He hurried out the revolving glass doors. Whitney let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Trespassers? You think you can order people around just because your boss lets you hold his briefcase? Get your supervisor down here right now." I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply looked past Whitney's shoulder and caught the eye of the head of building security, a towering man named David who had been waiting for my signal. I gave him a curt nod and snapped my fingers. David and three other guards immediately converged on my mother and sister. David placed a firm hand on Whitney's arm. You and your mother need to vacate the premises immediately," he stated, leaving no room for argument. Brenda swatted at the guard, her face turning crimson. "Take your hands off my daughter. Do you know who we are? We are looking for the manager of the cleaning staff. We have a lawsuit against this girl." David looked at my mother with absolute deadpan precision. "Lady, this building does not hire outside cleaners, and you are currently screaming at the chief executive officer who owns the property management firm that owns this entire skyscraper. Now walk out the door before I have you arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace." The color drained from Whitney's face so fast she looked like she might faint. Her eyes darted from the heavy gold watch on my wrist to the custom-tailored suit I was wearing, and finally to the terrified realization that the security guards were looking to me for orders, not the other way around. Brenda stammered, taking a step backward. "Chief executive. No, that is impossible. She cleans houses. She is broke. Escort them out," I told David, my voice echoing like ice in the massive lobby. "If they ever step foot on this property again, call the police." I turned my back on them and walked toward the private security doors leading to the executive suites. I did not look over my shoulder, even as I heard Whitney screaming my name and Brenda demanding answers while the guards physically escorted them out onto the busy city sidewalk. They had come to ruin a maid and had just been thrown out by a mogul. The humiliation in that lobby must have pushed Preston over the edge. I knew exactly how his mind worked. He was a narcissist, losing control of his narrative. When Whitney went home crying about the security guards in the penthouse elevator, Preston realized his fake cease and desist order had failed entirely. Worse, he still needed a massive infusion of cash to keep his fraudulent financial schemes afloat. His investors were likely demanding returns he did not have. He needed liquidity fast, and he knew I was not going to provide it. So he went to the weakest link in the family, my father. Calvin was a man completely obsessed with pride and legacy. He had worked his entire life to pay off the mortgage on his sprawling suburban home. That house was his crown jewel, his proof to the church congregation that he was a successful patriarch. Preston knew exactly how to manipulate that pride. He weaponized Calvin's desperate need to maintain a flawless image in the African American community. I could easily picture the conversation. Preston backing Calvin into a corner, spinning a web of panicked lies. Preston would tell him that my fake cleaning company was facing a federal indictment. He would claim that he needed cash immediately to hire a high-powered legal team to protect the family name from my supposed crimes. He would play on Calvin's terror of public embarrassment, convincing him that if the church found out about my non-existent legal troubles, their social standing would be destroyed forever. Preston used his white corporate privilege to assure Calvin that he alone could fix the mess. He promised he knew the right people in finance to make the charges disappear, but he needed untraceable cash. Preston convinced my father to secretly mortgage his fully paid-off home. He introduced Calvin to a private shadow lender offering a high-interest, distressed mortgage, assuring my father it was just a temporary bridge loan. Preston promised he would pay the mortgage back with his own massive financial bonuses next quarter. Calvin, blinded by his absolute faith in his son-in-law and his desperate need to maintain the family image, signed away the deed to his home. He handed the cash directly to Preston, essentially burning his entire life savings to protect a con artist. I was sitting at my mahogany desk later that afternoon, reviewing the final blueprints for our next commercial development. The silence of my office was a welcome relief after the chaos of the morning. I was just about to approve the transfer of funds when my private internal line rang. It was my chief financial officer, Michael, checking in from the acquisitions department. I picked up the phone. "What do you have for me, Michael?" "Jordan, we just had a highly unusual file hit the acquisition desk," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "You told me to monitor the shadow lending networks for any movement connected to Preston's offshore accounts. A new distressed high-yield mortgage was just processed through one of our subsidiary shell companies." I stopped writing. The pen hovered over the blueprint. "Who is the borrower?" Michael paused, taking a sharp breath. "The borrower is Calvin. Your dad just took out a massive predatory mortgage on his primary residence. The terms are brutal, Jordan. It carries a 20% interest rate with a balloon payment due in exactly 90 days. It is a total trap." I leaned back in my leather chair, staring blankly at the wall. "And the funds?" I asked. "The funds were immediately wired directly into Preston's failing investment fund," Michael confirmed. "Preston drained the equity and pushed your father into a loan he can never repay." A heavy silence fell over my office. Preston had actually done it. He had stripped my parents of their only real asset to save his own skin. And the ultimate irony was that Preston had used a shadow lender to facilitate the rapid transaction, completely unaware that my firm had quietly acquired that specific lending network 3 months ago. "Your father just mortgaged his house to our company," Michael said softly. "What do you want to do?" I took a slow breath, letting the reality of Michael's words settle into the quiet space of my office. My father, a man whose entire identity was built on his absolute authority and financial pride, had just mortgaged his paid-off home to a shadow firm. And he did it for a 20% interest rate with a 90-day balloon payment. It was financial suicide. It was the kind of desperate, reckless move a person only made when they were completely out of options and blinded by panic. "Process the loan, Michael," I said, keeping my voice level. "Let the funds transfer into Preston's accounts. I want a complete paper trail of every single cent. Track exactly where Preston moves that money. I want to know which offshore accounts he is trying to feed, and I want a full dossier on his internal communications. If he is stupid enough to use his corporate network to coordinate this fraud, our cyber team can pull the logs during our due diligence phase." "Are you entirely sure?" Jordan, Michael asked, his tone laced with professional concern. "Once those funds clear, your father is legally bound to a predatory contract. He will lose the house." "He has already lost the house," I replied coldly. "He lost it the second he decided protecting a white con artist was more important than protecting his own flesh and blood. Let the trap snap shut, Michael. I will tell you when it is time to collect." I ended the call and turned to look out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office. The city below was completely unaware of the absolute destruction I was preparing to unleash. For 31 years, I had played the role of the quiet disappointment. I had absorbed every insult, every condescending remark, every public humiliation my family threw at me. They thought I was weak because I chose silence. They did not understand that my silence was never submission. It was observation. And now I had every single piece of ammunition I needed to dismantle their entire fabricated reality. The perfect opportunity was only 48 hours away. Saturday evening arrived carrying the heavy, oppressive weight of a major social obligation. It was the night of the annual gala at our prominent African American community church. This was not just a religious gathering. It was the ultimate social battlefield for families like mine. It was a place where wealth status and the illusion of moral superiority were displayed like glittering trophies. For my mother, Brenda, this night was the highlight of her entire existence. She had spent the last decade maneuvering, manipulating, and bribing her way to the top of the church hierarchy. Tonight she was finally receiving the Matriarch of the Year award. I arrived at the venue, a massive, elegantly decorated banquet hall attached to the main sanctuary. I wore a floor-length midnight blue gown designed by a private tailor in Milan. It was understated but radiated an undeniable quiet luxury. As I walked through the double doors, I could feel the immediate shift in the atmosphere. The church aunties sitting near the entrance eyed me with a mixture of pity and barely concealed judgment. I knew exactly what my mother had been telling them. They still believed I was a struggling maid desperately trying to make ends meet while my golden sister lived in luxury. "Oh, bless your heart, Jordan," one of the elder women whispered as I passed, patting my arm with genuine condescension. "Your mother told us how hard you are working these days. It is so brave of you to show your face." I just offered a polite, serene smile and kept walking. I made my way to the back of the banquet hall, standing in the shadows near the audio-visual booth. I had absolutely no intention of sitting at the family table. I watched from afar as my family held court near the front of the stage. Whitney was draped in an aggressively sparkly maternity dress sitting next to Preston, who was wearing a tuxedo that screamed of new money desperation. My father Calvin sat rigidly beside them. He looked noticeably paler than usual, a sheen of nervous sweat visible on his forehead. The crushing weight of his secret predatory mortgage was clearly eating him alive, but he forced a tight smile for the cameras. And then there was Brenda. My mother was in her absolute element, waving to the congregation, kissing babies, and accepting endless praise. When the pastor finally took the stage to announce her award, the room erupted into thunderous applause. Brenda glided up the stairs, wiping away a perfectly rehearsed tear as she accepted the heavy glass trophy. She stepped up to the microphone, looking out over the crowd of 300 guests. She spoke about faith, about endurance, and about the sacrifices required to build a strong, respected family. She praised Whitney for her beautiful, growing family, highlighting her as the ultimate example of a godly woman. She praised Preston, calling him a pillar of financial wisdom and a true blessing to our community. Then her eyes scanned the crowd, searching the room until they finally locked onto me, standing in the shadows at the back of the hall. A triumphant, malicious spark ignited in her eyes. "But tonight is not just about my success," Brenda announced, her voice echoing through the massive speakers. "It is about the love that binds us together. As many of you know, my eldest daughter Whitney is expecting her 7th child. It is a joyful burden but a heavy one, and I am so incredibly humbled to share that my youngest daughter Jordan has decided to make a true Christian sacrifice for her family." The entire room went completely silent. 300 heads turned, following my mother's gaze toward the back of the room. "Jordan has humbly agreed to quit her little job," Brenda continued, projecting her voice to ensure every single person heard her. "She is moving out of her apartment to live with Whitney and Preston. She will be serving her sister full-time, cooking, cleaning, and caring for the children so Whitney can rest. It is a beautiful display of humility and servitude. Let us give Jordan a round of applause for finally stepping up and putting family first." The congregation erupted into cheers and polite applause. People were looking at me with approving nods, murmuring about how sweet and dutiful I was. It was the ultimate trap. My mother was using the intense cultural pressure of our church community to publicly corner me. She knew that in this environment, refusing to help a pregnant sister would be seen as a massive moral failure. She was weaponizing our religion and our community to force me into submission. She thought I would be too embarrassed to cause a scene. She thought I would just bow my head, accept my fate, and walk quietly into the prison she had built for me. She was entirely wrong. I did not bow my head. I walked forward. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor as I made my way down the center aisle. The applause slowly died down, replaced by a ripple of confused murmurs as the congregation noticed the absolute icy calm on my face. I walked straight up the stairs and stepped onto the stage. Brenda looked momentarily panicked, but quickly recovered, holding out her arms for a hug. I ignored her outstretched arms and took the microphone directly from the stand. "Thank you, Mother," I said, my voice ringing out crystal clear across the silent hall. "It is truly inspiring to hear you speak about humility and sacrifice. You have always been so deeply concerned with the truth and the integrity of this family, which is why I prepared a special presentation tonight, a tribute to the real foundation of this family." I turned slightly and gave a subtle hand signal to the technician in the audio-visual booth. I had paid him $5,000 in cash earlier that evening to bypass the church's regular presentation queue and play a specific file directly from my encrypted flash drive. The massive projection screens flanking the altar flickered to life. But it was not a slideshow of happy family memories. The screen remained entirely black, displaying only an audio waveform moving in time with a voice. It was Preston's voice. The audio was crystal clear, extracted from a recorded virtual meeting Preston had hosted on his company's servers just 24 hours prior. My cybersecurity team had pulled it during their routine due diligence investigation into his failing offshore accounts. Preston's voice echoed through the holy sanctuary, dripping with absolute arrogant venom. "I am telling you, it is pathetic!" Preston laughed, his recorded voice booming over the speakers. "These church folks are so desperate to look wealthy, they will sign anything. Calvin is the biggest fool of them all. He just handed me the deed to his house. I got the old man to mortgage his entire life savings for a 20% interest loan, and he actually thanked me for it." A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. I saw my father physically recoil in his chair, his face draining of all color. Brenda froze, her hands trembling as she stared up at the speakers in pure horror. But the recording was not finished. "You just have to know how to play them." Preston's recorded voice continued, growing increasingly vile. "You stroke their egos. You talk about community empowerment, and they empty their pockets. It is almost too easy to drain these people. They are so obsessed with having a white financial advisor at their dinner table, they ignore the fact that I am completely robbing them blind. Calvin and Brenda are idiots. They are literally funding my lifestyle, and they think they are the ones in charge. I will drain every last dime out of that congregation before the year is over." The audio ended with the sickening sound of Preston laughing, a cruel, dismissive sound that hung in the absolute dead silence of the sanctuary. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. The sheer shock of hearing those blatant racial slurs and the horrific admission of financial abuse broadcast in the middle of a church gala paralyzed the entire room. Then the church erupted into absolute pure chaos. The elders in the front row stood up, shouting in outrage. Several men moved toward the family table, their faces twisted in fury. Women were screaming, demanding answers. The pastor rushed toward the stage, looking completely horrified. I stood perfectly still, holding the microphone, watching the destruction of my mother's carefully curated universe. Preston jumped up from his chair. His face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. He realized in an instant that his entire life was over. His fraud was exposed, his investors were in the room, and he was surrounded by 300 people he had just deeply insulted. His panic rapidly mutated into violent rage. He locked eyes with me standing on the stage. "You," Preston screamed, his voice cracking with fury. "You set me up, you liar!" He lunged forward, shoving chairs out of his way, and charged toward the stage. His fists were clenched and his eyes were wild with the desperate, violent urge to silence me. My father Calvin tried to grab his arm, but Preston threw him off, sending the older man crashing into the table. Whitney was screaming, crying hysterically, and clutching her pregnant stomach as the crowd around them surged forward. Preston reached the first step of the stage, his face contorted in rage. I did not move a single inch. I just looked down at him with absolute cold satisfaction. Before Preston's foot could hit the second step, a sound shattered the chaos inside the hall. It was the loud, piercing wail of police sirens tearing through the night air outside. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the massive stained glass windows, casting fractured, colorful shadows across the panicked congregation. The heavy oak doors at the back of the sanctuary burst open. A team of uniformed police officers and armed federal agents marched into the hall, their presence immediately commanding the room. The shouting died down, replaced by a tense, terrified silence. Preston stopped dead in his tracks on the stairs. The color completely vanished from his face. He slowly raised his hands, backing away from the stage, his eyes darting frantically toward the exits. He thought they were coming for him. The entire congregation thought they were coming for the white con artist who had just admitted to stealing their money. But the federal agents did not even look at Preston. They marched straight down the center aisle, their heavy boots echoing on the hardwood floor. They walked right past a trembling Preston. They walked past a sobbing Whitney. They stepped up to the front table and stopped directly in front of my father. Calvin, who was still struggling to stand up after Preston had shoved him, looked at the agents in total bewildered shock. Calvin Williams, the lead federal agent, announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent church. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. Put your hands behind your back." The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the dead silence of the sanctuary. My father, Calvin, a man who had spent his entire life cultivating an image of unimpeachable moral authority and financial superiority, was suddenly pulled forward by two federal agents. His arms were twisted behind his back. The custom-tailored suit he wore to accept the praise of his peers now looked like a costume he had no right to wear. He stumbled, his eyes wide with a frantic, terrified confusion as he scanned the room looking for someone to stop this impossible nightmare. His gaze landed on Preston, who was backing away toward the choir loft, his face pale and slick with sweat. "There has been a mistake," Calvin stammered, his voice cracking as the agent secured the cuffs. "I am a respected member of this community. I am the treasurer of this church. You have the wrong man." "We have the exact right man," Mr. Williams, the lead agent, said, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy. "Your signature is on every single fraudulent transfer that drained the church building fund over the last 6 months. You also authorized a predatory mortgage on your own property and routed those funds directly into an offshore holding company. The paper trail begins and ends with you." Calvin looked at Preston, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrific realization. Preston had handed him those documents. Preston had told him they were standard investment forms to grow the church's wealth. Preston had used Calvin's absolute blind trust to make him the perfect fall guy. "Tell them, Preston," Calvin pleaded, his voice rising to a desperate shout. "Tell them it was your investment strategy. Tell them you handled the paperwork." Preston did not say a word. He just kept backing away, his hands raised in a gesture of false surrender. "I have no idea what you are talking about," Calvin Preston said, his voice trembling with manufactured shock. "I just gave you financial advice. I never told you to steal from the church. You must have acted on your own." The betrayal was so swift and absolute that it literally sucked the air out of the room. A collective gasp rose from the congregation. The people who had just been applauding my family were now staring at my father with absolute disgust. My mother, Brenda, let out a piercing theatrical shriek. Her entire world, her entire identity was built on the perception of her perfection. Seeing her husband handcuffed in front of the pastor and the entire church board was a reality her fragile ego simply could not process. She clutched her chest, her eyes rolling back into her head, and she collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor in a dead faint. Her heavy glass Matriarch of the Year award shattered beside her, sending shards of glass flying across the aisle. Whitney dropped to her knees beside our mother, screaming for someone to call an ambulance. She looked up at Preston, her face stained with tears, begging him to do something. But Preston was already slipping out the side door, disappearing into the night, while my father was marched down the center aisle in handcuffs. I watched the entire spectacle from the stage, my face perfectly impassive. The empire of lies they had built to keep me beneath them had finally burned to the ground. Several hours later, I sat in the sterile, brightly lit waiting area of the downtown police precinct. I was there to provide a formal statement to Officer Carter and the federal agents regarding the identity theft Preston had attempted against me, which was now officially tied to the larger federal fraud case. I had already spoken to my chief financial officer, Michael, ensuring that my firm cooperated fully with the authorities to trace the offshore accounts. The double doors of the precinct swung open and Whitney rushed in, supporting our mother. Brenda looked completely disheveled, her designer dress wrinkled and her hair wild. Whitney spotted me sitting quietly in the corner and immediately dragged Brenda toward me. They did not look apologetic. They looked angry. "Jordan." Whitney snapped, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "What are you doing just sitting there? You need to fix this right now." I slowly stood up, smoothing the front of my suit. "Fix what exactly, Whitney?" I asked, keeping my tone mild. "Your husband abandoned your father to federal agents while you were crying on the floor. I am just here to give a statement." "Do not play games with me, Jordan," Brenda hissed, grabbing my arm with a desperate grip. I pulled my arm away, immediately stepping out of her reach. "Your father is in a holding cell like a common criminal. The bail magistrate set his bond at $50,000 cash. The church accounts are frozen, and the bank locked our personal accounts pending the investigation. We cannot get the money." "And you want me to do what I asked?" Though I already knew exactly what she was going to say. "You need to pay it," Brenda demanded, her eyes wild with panic. "I know you have savings, Jordan. You live in a cheap little rental and you clean houses all day. You must have $50,000 saved up from your cleaning money. You are going to write a check to the bail bondsman right now and get your father out of there. You owe us that much after the stunt you pulled tonight." I stared at her, completely amazed by the absolute delusion she still clung to. Her husband was facing federal prison, her son-in-law was a con artist, and she was still trying to order me around like an obedient maid. "I am not paying Calvin's bail," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper. "He signed those papers. He mortgaged the house you love so much to a shadow firm. He trusted Preston over his own daughter. He can sit in that cell and think about his choices." "You are a monster," Whitney screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Preston is a good man. He told us exactly what happened on the ride over here. He told us you set him up." I raised an eyebrow, genuinely curious about the depth of Preston's lies. "Oh, did he now?" "Yes," Whitney cried out. "Preston said you were so jealous of my perfect life and my beautiful family that you hacked into his computer. He said you fabricated that audio recording using digital software to make it sound like him. He said you manipulated the church accounts to frame Dad just to ruin my pregnancy. You are a sick, jealous spinster who wants to destroy us because you have no one who loves you." I let out a slow, soft laugh that seemed to unnerve them both. "Preston is a very creative liar," I said. "But federal agents do not arrest people based on fake audio recordings, Whitney. They arrest people based on wire transfers, bank logs, and digital footprints. Preston stole from the church. Preston stole from our parents. He tried to steal from me. And he is going to leave you holding the bag while he runs." "Preston would never leave me," Whitney sobbed, clutching her stomach. "He loves me. He went home to pack a bag for Dad. He is bringing the bail money right now. He promised." I looked at my sister, seeing nothing but a pathetic woman who had built her entire existence on the illusion of superiority. "He is not packing a bag for Calvin," I told her, my voice filled with cold certainty. "He is packing a bag for himself. He is running Whitney, and he is not taking you with him." Brenda let out a hysterical noise, covering her ears. "Stop it. Stop telling these awful lies. You are dead to us, Jordan. Do you hear me? Dead to us." "I already told you, Mom," I replied, turning away from them. "I died to you years ago. You just forgot to bury me. Enjoy the rest of your night." I walked out of the precinct into the cool night air, leaving them to their delusions. I got into my car and picked up my phone. I dialed Michael, who answered on the first ring. "Where is he?" I asked, pulling out into the sparse midnight traffic. "He is exactly where we thought he would be," Michael said, the sound of rapid typing echoing in the background. "My cyber team has been tracking his phone signals since he fled the church. He went back to their gated community, packed a single duffel bag, and took a private car service. He is currently walking into the international terminal at the airport. He is trying to book a red-eye flight to a non-extradition territory." Preston was moving with frantic, paranoid energy. I could perfectly picture him sweating through his expensive designer shirt, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. He had abandoned his pregnant wife without a second thought. He had left his father-in-law to take the fall for a massive federal crime. All that mattered to Preston was saving his own skin and getting to the millions of dollars he thought he had successfully stashed in his offshore drop accounts. "Keep monitoring the accounts," I told Michael, my voice low and steady as I navigated the empty city streets. "Tell me the exact second he tries to move the funds." "I am watching it live," Michael replied, his voice tight with anticipation. He just reached the premium ticketing counter. Inside the brightly lit, sterile environment of the international terminal, Preston stood before a bewildered ticketing agent. He slammed his passport onto the counter, demanding a first-class one-way ticket on the next available flight out of the country. He did not care where it was going as long as it was far away from the jurisdiction of the federal agents currently dismantling his life. The ticketing agent typed his information into the system and calmly asked for a form of payment. Preston pulled out his heavy metal black card, the ultimate symbol of his fabricated wealth and limitless credit. He handed it over with a trembling hand, his eyes constantly scanning the terminal entrance for police uniforms. The agent swiped the card through the machine. She frowned, looking at the computer screen. She tried it a second time. "Sir, I am sorry, but this card has been declined," the agent said, sliding the heavy metal card back across the counter. "Do you have another form of payment?" "Declined." Preston snapped, his voice cracking with panic. "That is impossible. Run it again. There are millions in that account. Run it again." The agent obliged, but the result was identical. She shook her head, offering a polite but firm, apologetic smile. "I am sorry, sir. The system is showing a hard lock on this account. I cannot process the transaction." Preston cursed violently under his breath. He snatched the card from the counter and pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He opened his banking application, desperately trying to access his offshore portfolios. He needed to wire the money directly. He needed to prove he had the funds to escape the nightmare closing in around him. As he frantically tapped the screen, a notification popped up blocking his access. It was an automated text message from his primary financial institution. Preston stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat as his entire world completely and totally collapsed. The message was brief and absolute. "Your access has been permanently revoked. The Internal Revenue Service and federal authorities have frozen all assets connected to your personal and business accounts pending criminal investigation." I sat in my car listening to Michael relay the real-time updates from our cyber team. "He is locked out, Jordan." Michael said, a rare note of triumph in his voice. "He has nothing. No money, no flight, no way out." I smiled, staring out at the city skyline. "Let the feds pick him up at the terminal," I said softly. "It is time to finish this." Preston did not make it onto a plane that night. He was surrounded by federal agents before he could even take 2 steps away from the premium ticketing counter. They confiscated his passport, his phone, and the useless heavy metal credit card he had just tried to use to flee the country. Because the federal investigation into his massive offshore financial crimes was still in the grand jury phase, the authorities eventually released him after 48 hours of grueling interrogation. But his life as he knew it was entirely, completely over. The Internal Revenue Service seized his business accounts. The Securities and Exchange Commission froze every single one of his personal assets. The luxury vehicles he leased under his fake corporate umbrella were impounded immediately. Within a week, the illusion of their perfect wealthy lifestyle completely shattered. The bank initiated an emergency eviction on the massive mansion in the gated community. Whitney called my mother, crying hysterically, begging for a place to stay, but Brenda could not help her. Calvin was out on bail, but his own assets were locked down, and the house he had secretly mortgaged to my shadow firm was already in the initial stages of default. Whitney and Preston were completely, utterly broke. They had no cash, no credit, and no friends willing to take in a disgraced financial advisor facing federal prison time. With nowhere else to go, they made a desperate, malicious plan. They assumed I was still a terrified maid living in a rundown rental. For years, I had maintained a lease on a small, modest house in a working-class neighborhood on the edge of the city, purely as a decoy address. It kept my family from ever finding out about my luxury penthouse or my massive real estate empire. Whenever they demanded to know where I lived, I gave them that address. They decided that since I was family, I owed them a place to stay. And because they believed I was beneath them, they decided they did not even need to ask my permission to move in. My phone buzzed with an alert from the security cameras I had installed at the decoy property. I opened the application on my office computer and watched the live feed in absolute disbelief. Preston and Whitney had just pulled up to the curb in a beat-up sedan they must have borrowed from a desperate friend. They were dragging black plastic trash bags stuffed with whatever designer clothes they had managed to smuggle out of their foreclosed mansion. But they were not alone. Preston had brought a man with a heavy tool bag, a locksmith. They did not plan to ask me for help. They planned to break into my home, throw my belongings onto the street, and illegally evict me. They intended to change the locks and force me to live in my car while they claimed squatters' rights on my lease. I watched the live video feed as the locksmith walked up to the front porch and began inspecting the deadbolt. Whitney stood behind him, her pregnant belly pushing against a wrinkled silk blouse, her face twisted into a mask of ugly, furious entitlement. She began pounding her fist against the wooden door, assuming I was cowering inside, too afraid to answer. "Open this door, Jordan!" Whitney screamed, her shrill voice echoing down the quiet street through the camera microphone. "We know you are in there hiding like a coward. You owe us this house. You have no husband and no children. You do not need a whole house to yourself. Open the door and pack your bags. Preston is taking over the lease." I sat at my mahogany desk watching her scream at an empty house. The sheer audacity of her entitlement was staggering. She genuinely believed that because she was the golden child, my life and my property were simply extensions of her own belongings to be seized whenever she deemed necessary. "You owe me this!" Whitney yelled, kicking the bottom of the door, leaving a scuff mark on the white paint. "You have always been a selfish, ungrateful brat. You never shared anything with me. Just like when Mom had to force you to give me your prom dress because mine did not fit. You should be honored to help your pregnant sister." The mention of the prom dress made the blood freeze in my veins. It was a memory I had buried deep down, a perfect encapsulation of how my family operated. I was 18 years old. I had worked cleaning houses on weekends for 6 months to save up enough money to buy a beautiful custom emerald green gown for my senior prom. Whitney was 21 at the time, home visiting from college. She had a formal sorority gala to attend, but she had gained weight and could not squeeze into the expensive dress our parents had bought for her. The night before my prom, Brenda walked into my bedroom, took my carefully saved emerald gown out of the closet, and handed it directly to Whitney. When I cried and begged them not to take it, Brenda told me to stop being so selfish and dramatic. She said Whitney needed to look presentable for her important college friends. Whitney wore my custom dress to her party, and I went to my senior prom in a cheap, itchy polyester gown from a discount store. Whitney was using that exact same twisted logic right now to justify stealing my house. She believed that simply because she wanted it, she was entitled to take it. I closed the security application on my computer. I stood up from my desk and grabbed my keys. It was time to give my sister a reality check she would never forget. I did not take my unassuming sedan this time. I walked down to the private executive garage and unlocked my custom gloss black Porsche Panamera. The engine roared to life with a deep, guttural purr echoing off the concrete walls. I drove out of the financial district, the sleek car gliding through the city streets, until I reached the working-class neighborhood where my decoy house was located. As I turned the corner onto the street, I saw them. The locksmith had just attached a heavy drill to the deadbolt. Preston was leaning against the porch railing, looking pale and defeated, but still clinging to a shred of his old arrogance. Whitney was pacing the small front lawn, yelling into her phone, probably complaining to our mother that the maid was refusing to open the door. I did not call the police. I did not need to. I pressed my foot on the accelerator and the Porsche let out a massive roar. I swerved smoothly into the driveway, the expensive tires crunching over the gravel. I parked the car perfectly parallel to the front porch, stopping just inches from Preston's borrowed sedan. The locksmith immediately stopped drilling and took a nervous step back. Preston froze, his eyes widening as he took in the low, sleek profile of the luxury sports car. Whitney dropped her phone, her jaw literally falling open as the tinted driver's side window rolled down. I turned off the engine and pushed the heavy door open. I stepped out of the Porsche wearing custom designer heels and a sharply tailored slate gray business suit. I reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a sleek leather folder. Whitney stared at me, her eyes darting frantically from the gleaming hood of the Porsche to the expensive cut of my suit. Her brain was completely short-circuiting. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out except a confused, sputtering sound. Preston pushed himself off the porch railing, his hands trembling. "Whose car is that?" Preston stammered, his voice betraying his absolute panic. "Why are you driving a car like that? Did you steal it?" I walked slowly up the driveway, the sound of my heels clicking sharply against the concrete. I did not look at Preston. I looked directly at the locksmith, who was already packing his tools into his bag, sensing that he had just stepped into a massive legal liability. "You can put the drill away," I told the locksmith, my voice projecting a calm, absolute authority. "If you damage that door, I will have my corporate legal team sue you for destruction of private property. You can leave now." The locksmith did not hesitate. He grabbed his bag, muttered a quick apology, and practically sprinted down the street. Whitney finally found her voice, her face turning a blotchy red. "What kind of game are you playing, Jordan?" she shrieked, pointing at the car. "Who did you rent that from to try and impress us? You are a maid. Open this door right now so we can move our things inside. We are taking over this lease." I stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at my sister. The delusion was so deeply embedded in her psyche that she literally could not process the reality standing right in front of her. "You cannot break into this house, Whitney," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and devoid of any emotion. "Not because I rent it, but because my corporation owns it. I own this house. I own the land it sits on. And I own the high-rise building you tried to get me fired from last week." Preston's face drained of all remaining color. He took a step backward, bumping into the wooden railing. "Your corporation," he repeated the words, barely a whisper. "Vanguard Real Estate and Technology," I said, looking directly into his terrified eyes. "I am the founder and chief executive officer. You spent the entire dinner at the French Quarter restaurant insulting my intelligence while bragging about your financial acumen. You thought I was scrubbing toilets while I was quietly acquiring half the commercial real estate in this city." Whitney shook her head violently, refusing to believe it. "No," she yelled, stamping her foot on the porch. "No, you are lying. You are a cleaner. Mom and Dad said you were a failure. You do not own a corporation." I calmly opened the leather folder I was holding. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal paper and held it out toward Preston. "And speaking of owning things," I said, a cold, hard smile touching my lips, "you might want to check your email, Preston." Preston frantically dug his phone out of his pocket. His hands were shaking so violently he dropped it on the porch floor before snatching it back up. He opened his email application, his eyes scanning the screen. "What is it?" Whitney demanded, grabbing his arm. "Preston, what does it say?" Preston's knees seemed to give out. He slumped back against the front door, sliding down until he was sitting on the porch, staring at the screen in absolute total horror. "Your entire debt portfolio was just bought out by a single holding company," I explained, folding my arms across my chest. "Every single predatory loan, every margin call, every piece of toxic debt you accumulated while trying to cover up your federal fraud. It was all bundled and sold to a private acquisitions firm this morning." Preston looked up at me, his eyes filled with tears of pure terror. "You," he choked out. "You bought my debt. I bought all of it. I confirmed, stepping closer to the porch. I am your sole creditor, Preston. You owe me everything. You thought you could steal my identity to save yourself. You thought you could destroy my parents to cover your tracks. Now I own your financial future, and I am going to make sure you pay back every single cent while you are sitting in a federal prison cell. Whitney let out a long, desperate wail, dropping to her knees beside Preston. This cannot be happening, she sobbed, clinging to his shirt. Jordan, please, you have to help us. We are family. You owe us. I looked down at them, surrounded by trash bags full of stolen designer clothes, cowering on the porch of a house I used as a decoy. I do not owe you anything, I said, my voice as cold as ice. Now get off my property before I have you arrested for trespassing. I turned my back on them and walked back to my Porsche. As I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, my phone buzzed on the dashboard. It was my chief financial officer, Michael. I picked up the call, putting it on speaker as I pulled out of the driveway, leaving Whitney and Preston sobbing on the lawn. Jordan, Michael said, his voice tight with urgency. A new distressed mortgage just hit our acquisition desk. The borrower is Calvin. I kept my eyes on the road, the final piece of the puzzle falling perfectly into place. I know, I said. Michael paused. Your dad just mortgaged his house to our shadow firm, Jordan. What do you want to do? I watched Calvin stare at the red folder. His hands began to tremble slightly. The smooth, arrogant patriarch who had just tried to command my obedience was gone. In his place was a terrified old man whose deepest, darkest secret had just been dragged into the light. Open it, I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls. Calvin did not move. He kept his eyes fixed on the folder as if touching it would seal his fate. Whitney, who was still standing behind Preston's weeping form, looked utterly confused. She had been so insulated by her own entitlement that she never questioned how our parents maintained their lifestyle. What is she talking about, Dad? Whitney asked, her voice shrill and trembling. What did you do to Grandpa's estate? When he died 12 years ago, Grandpa left a very specific will, I explained, keeping my eyes locked on Calvin's panicked face. He knew exactly who Calvin and Brenda really were. He knew they were obsessed with status and completely irresponsible with capital. So he bypassed them entirely. He left his entire commercial property portfolio to be split equally between his two granddaughters in a blind trust. Half for Whitney and half for me. We were supposed to gain access when we turned 25. Whitney gasped, bringing her hands to her mouth. We had properties, she whispered, looking at Calvin in horror. You told me Grandpa died broke. You told me he had nothing left but medical debt. He did not die broke, I said flatly. He died wealthy. But our parents could not stand the idea of us having financial independence. They could not tolerate the thought of losing control over our futures. So they hired a corrupt attorney. They forged a secondary codicil to the will, claiming Grandpa was suffering from dementia in his final days. They contested the trust, tied the estate up in probate, and quietly liquidated every single commercial property. Calvin finally found his voice, though it was weak and raspy. We needed the money, Jordan. The business was struggling. We had appearances to keep up. We were protecting the family legacy. You were protecting your country club memberships. I shot back, slamming my hand flat against the mahogany table. The sound made everyone in the room flinch. You stole millions of dollars from your own children. You used my half of the inheritance to fund Whitney's lavish lifestyle, to pay for her destination wedding, to buy Preston's approval. And you used Whitney's half to pay off your own personal debts so you could pretend you were a successful businessman at the church galas. You are not a patriarch, Calvin. You are a thief. Whitney let out a sound like a wounded animal. She lunged forward, grabbing Calvin's arm, shaking him violently. You stole from me! Whitney screamed, her pregnant belly pressing against the table. You let me marry this loser because you needed his fake money while you were sitting on my inheritance. You ruined my life. Calvin tried to push her away, looking around the boardroom wildly, as if searching for an escape route that did not exist. Preston stopped crying long enough to look at his father-in-law with pure venom, realizing that the wealthy family he thought he had married into was actually built on stolen funds. They were a circle of parasites, and they were finally turning on each other. I sat back in my leather chair watching them tear themselves apart. For 31 years, they had united against me using my supposed failures as the glue that held their miserable dynamic together. Now stripped of their lies and faced with total financial annihilation, they were eating each other alive. This brings us to our current situation, I said, raising my voice just enough to cut through Whitney's screaming and Calvin's defensive shouting. They instantly went silent, turning to look at me with identical expressions of trapped panic. I own the debt on your house, Calvin, I said, tapping my finger against the table. And because the loan Preston brokered was completely fraudulent and initiated with funds you acquired through federal wire fraud, the deed is now officially in default. My holding company is executing a hostile takeover of the property. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises before my security team arrives to physically remove your belongings. You cannot do this! Calvin roared, his face turning purple again. That is my home. You cannot throw your own parents out on the street. You threw me out when I was a teenager, I reminded him, my voice cold and hard. You forced me to live on couches and scrub floors while you drank expensive wine paid for with my stolen inheritance. You made your choices, Calvin. Now you get to live in the reality you created. I turned my gaze to Whitney, who was hyperventilating, clutching the edge of the table for support. And Whitney, I continued, your husband owes me $4 million. The federal government is going to seize whatever pathetic assets you have left to pay restitution to the church. You are broke. You are homeless. And your fake cease and desist order over a non-existent cleaning company is going straight to the federal prosecutor as evidence of witness intimidation. Whitney collapsed into an empty chair, weeping hysterically. Preston simply stared at the floor, looking entirely broken. The meeting is over, I announced, standing up from my chair and buttoning my suit jacket. My legal team will handle all further communication. Do not attempt to contact me. Do not attempt to visit my properties. If any of you ever step foot near my building again, I will have you arrested for trespassing. I walked past them without a single glance backward. I pressed the button for the private elevator and stepped inside, letting the heavy glass doors slide shut. Through the glass, I could see them still frozen in the boardroom, completely destroyed by the weight of their own actions. When the elevator reached the lobby, I walked out into the bright city sunlight. The air felt clean and sharp in my lungs. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Marcus Sterling, the billionaire developer I had partnered with. The funds have cleared for the new commercial project, Marcus wrote. Looking forward to breaking ground with you, Jordan. Your vision is exactly what the city needs. I smiled, locking my phone and sliding it into my pocket. I had survived their abuse. I had outsmarted their greed. I had dismantled their entire empire of lies and reclaimed everything they had stolen from me. They were returning to the absolute rock bottom they had designed for me, while I was stepping into a future I had built entirely on my own. I walked toward my car, leaving the past exactly where it belonged, behind me. Calvin opened the red folder, his hands shaking so violently the thick papers rustled against the polished mahogany table. The silence in the massive boardroom was absolute. Every single breath echoed in the cold, sterile space as he stared at the top document. It was a certified copy of the original trust agreement, established by my grandfather. I watched Calvin's eyes dart across the page, taking in the familiar signatures and the undeniable legal proof of his ultimate betrayal. My grandfather was the only person in our entire family who ever saw me for who I truly was. He did not care about social climbing or country club memberships or expensive cars. He cared about character and hard work. And he knew exactly how ruthless and shallow my parents were. That is why he bypassed them entirely when he set up his most personal financial legacy. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the long table, keeping my gaze locked on my father's pale, sweating face. The second page in that folder is a letter from grandfather. I said, my voice low and steady, echoing clearly through the room. He wrote it exactly 1 month before his heart gave out. He explicitly stated that he was leaving a $2 million trust fund exclusively for me. Not for Whitney, not for the family business, just for me and my future business ideas. He knew I had the mind of an entrepreneur, and he wanted to ensure I had the capital to build my own empire far away from your toxic control. Whitney let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. $2 million, she whispered, her eyes wide with shock. You had $2 million. I did not have anything, Whitney. I corrected her, turning my cold gaze toward my sister. I never saw a single cent of that money. Because the very week I turned 18, the exact week the trust was scheduled to legally transfer into my name, our parents decided they could not let that happen. They could not stand the idea of the family disappointment suddenly having more wealth and independence than their golden child. So they stole it. Calvin swallowed hard, unable to look up from the folder. A bead of sweat dripped down the side of his face. The third document is the most interesting one, Dad, I continued, leaning back in my leather chair. It is a court order from 12 years ago. A medical declaration signed by a corrupt psychiatrist you paid off. You and Mom went before a judge and testified under oath that I was suffering from severe psychological issues. You submitted forged medical records claiming I was mentally unstable and entirely incapable of managing my own affairs. You filed for emergency conservatorship over my estate before I even knew the trust existed. Brenda let out a small, terrified whimper from the other end of the table. She clutched her designer handbag to her chest, as if the expensive leather could somehow protect her from the devastating truth filling the room. You committed medical and financial fraud, I said, my voice growing colder and sharper with every word. You stripped me of my legal rights. You branded your own daughter as mentally unfit just so you could hijack the trust fund Grandfather left for me. You spent years telling everyone in our community that I was a failure, that I lacked ambition, that I was a lost cause. But the entire time you were hiding the fact that you had literally stolen my future to fund your own pathetic obsession with status. I watched Whitney process this information. Her perfectly manicured hands were shaking as she looked back and forth between Calvin and Brenda. Where did the money go? She asked, her voice shrill and trembling. Mom, where did Jordan's money go? I will tell you exactly where it went, I said, sliding another printed spreadsheet across the smooth surface of the table. It went into your lifestyle, Whitney. $2 million drained completely dry over the course of a decade. $500,000 was used as the initial seed money for Preston's fraudulent startup company. You thought your brilliant husband secured angel investors. He did not. He secured stolen funds from your parents, who used my inheritance to buy his loyalty and fund his fake empire. Preston shrank back against the wall, his face a mask of pure terror. He knew I had every single bank record, every wire transfer, every digital receipt linking him to the stolen trust. He was completely exposed. Another $300,000 went toward the down payment on that massive gated community mansion you just got evicted from, I continued relentlessly. The designer clothes you are currently wearing, the luxury vehicles you drove, the elaborate destination wedding you threw to impress people who do not even care about you. All of it was paid for with my money. You lived a life of absolute luxury while looking down on me for cleaning houses. You treated me like dirt under your expensive shoes, never realizing that I bought those shoes. Your entire existence was a carefully constructed fantasy funded entirely by my stolen inheritance. The sheer weight of the truth settled over the boardroom, crushing whatever defiance my family had left. For years, I had absorbed their insults. I had stood silently at holiday dinners while Brenda mocked my clothes and my job. I had listened to Calvin brag about Whitney's fictional success while treating my very presence as an embarrassment. The rage I had buried for over a decade finally boiled over, rising up from my chest and spilling out into the open. You did not just favor her, I said, my voice shaking with a raw, visceral fury that demanded their absolute attention. You actively stole my future to build her a throne. You looked at your own child and decided I was nothing more than a resource to be exploited. You forged documents. You committed felonies. You looked me in the eye every single day and told me I was worthless while you secretly lived off the wealth my grandfather intended for me. You built a prison of lies and locked me inside it just so Whitney could play the role of the perfect daughter. Brenda burst into tears. Real tears this time, though they were entirely rooted in self-pity. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed loudly in the quiet room. "We were just trying to protect the family, Jordan," she cried, her voice muffled and pathetic. "You were so young, you did not know how to handle money. You were always so quiet and strange. We thought you would waste it all. Whitney had a plan. Whitney needed to maintain our social standing. We only did what we thought was best for everyone." Best for everyone, I repeated, standing up from my chair and planting my hands on the table. "You mean best for you. You needed Whitney to succeed because she was your trophy. She was the daughter you could show off to your shallow country club friends. But she had no actual talent and no real ambition. So you stole my resources to prop her up. You sacrificed my life on the altar of your own ego, and you did it so easily. You never felt a single ounce of guilt." Calvin finally looked up, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked at the documents, then looked at me. He suddenly realized the absolute devastating reality of his situation. He was broke. He was facing federal wire fraud charges for the church scandal. His house was gone. And the daughter he had abused and stolen from was now a multimillionaire who held his entire fate in her hands. His survival instincts kicked in, overriding his shame. "Jordan," Calvin said, his voice dropping into a low, pleading tone, "you are right. We made terrible mistakes. We were foolish and greedy, and we wronged you deeply. But you are a wealthy woman now. You built an incredible corporation. You do not need that old debt. You have more money than we could ever imagine. As your father, I am begging you, forgive the debt on the house. Drop the claims against us. We are blood, Jordan. You cannot destroy your own family." I stared at the pathetic, broken man sitting across from me. He was still trying to manipulate the situation. He was still trying to use the concept of family as a weapon to avoid the consequences of his own actions. "I would, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly level. "Except I just found out what you and Mom did to Grandpa's estate. You crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. You ceased being my family the moment you signed those forged medical papers. I am not destroying you. I am simply holding a mirror up to the destruction you created yourselves." The boardroom erupted into total chaos. Whitney turned on Brenda, screaming at the top of her lungs, accusing our mother of ruining her life and making her complicit in a federal crime. Brenda wailed hysterically, clutching at Calvin's arm, while he shouted over both of them, desperately trying to regain control of a situation that was completely beyond his power. Amidst the shouting and the crying, I noticed movement by the far wall. Preston. While the Williams family tore each other to pieces, Preston had realized the absolute certainty of his doom. He was broke. He was exposed. He had funded his fraudulent company with stolen trust money, and he had drained a church building fund. He was surrounded by massive legal liabilities, and there was no way out. His survival instinct pushed him toward the only option he had left: escape. He kept his back against the glass wall, slowly sliding inch by inch toward the heavy double doors of the boardroom. He did not say a word to Whitney, who was too busy screaming at Brenda to notice her husband abandoning her for the second time that week. Preston reached the doors, pushed them open silently, and slipped out into the grand reception area. I watched him go, my expression completely blank. I did not move to stop him. I did not even raise my voice. I simply waited. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the boardroom, I had a perfect view of the reception area and the private executive elevators. I watched Preston scurry across the marble floor, his expensive shoes slipping slightly in his frantic haste. He reached the elevator bank and jammed his finger against the call button repeatedly, his face a mask of panicked desperation. He kept looking over his shoulder, terrified that I would come after him. A soft chime echoed through the reception area, signaling the arrival of the elevator. Preston let out a visible sigh of relief, stepping forward as the polished metal doors slid open. He expected an empty cab to carry him down to the street, where he could disappear into the city and run from his crimes. But the elevator was not empty. Two tall men in dark suits stepped out, blocking Preston's path. They moved with absolute synchronized authority, their postures rigid and commanding. Heavy tactical belts were visible beneath their suit jackets, and bright yellow lettering on their windbreakers spelled out federal agents. Preston froze perfectly still. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He took a slow, terrified step backward, raising his hands instinctively. Preston Vance, the lead agent, said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the open boardroom doors. "We have a warrant for your arrest." Preston opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His knees buckled slightly, and the second agent immediately stepped forward, grabbing his arm and spinning him around. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent reception area, sharp and final. Whitney, who had finally noticed Preston's absence, stopped screaming at Brenda. She turned toward the glass walls just in time to see the federal agents securing the handcuffs around her husband's wrists. She let out a horrific, piercing scream and ran out of the boardroom toward the elevators. "Preston," she cried, reaching out for him. "Preston, where are you going? What is happening? What is—" The lead agent stepped between Whitney and Preston, holding up a firm hand to stop her advance. "Ma'am, step back," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Your husband is being taken into federal custody for multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. You will need to contact an attorney." Whitney dropped to her knees on the cold marble floor, sobbing hysterically as the agents marched Preston into the elevator. The doors slid shut, severing her from the man who had promised her the world and left her with absolutely nothing. Inside the boardroom, Calvin and Brenda sat frozen in their chairs, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the devastation surrounding them. They had lost their wealth, their status, their home, and their golden child's perfect marriage in a matter of hours. They had nothing left. Absolutely nothing. I stood quietly at the head of the mahogany table, gathering the red folder and sliding it into my leather briefcase. I looked at the three of them one last time. The broken patriarch, the weeping manipulator, and the shattered golden child. They were exactly where they belonged. I picked up my briefcase and walked out of the boardroom, the sound of my heels echoing against the marble floor. I walked past Whitney, who was still crying silently by the elevators. I pressed the call button for the second car, waiting calmly as it arrived. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the lobby, and let the doors close, leaving the ruins of my former family behind me forever. The months following the boardroom confrontation moved with absolute clinical precision. I watched from the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse as the federal government methodically dismantled the fraudulent empire my family had tried to build. Preston sat in a federal holding facility because my mother and father were entirely broke and could not post his bail. The massive mansion in the gated community went into foreclosure. Calvin and Brenda were forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. Whitney, heavily pregnant and completely in denial, refused to accept reality. She visited Preston in jail every single week, holding on to his desperate lies. She genuinely believed that Preston was an innocent victim and that I was the villain who had orchestrated their downfall. The federal trial began on a crisp Tuesday morning. I arrived at the courthouse in my custom Porsche, wearing a tailored midnight blue suit that projected absolute authority. I walked into the courtroom flanked by my legal team and took my seat in the front row, right behind the prosecutors. Preston sat at the defense table. He looked absolutely terrible. He had lost weight and his skin had a grayish, sickly pallor. The arrogant, smug financial advisor who had tried to steal my house was gone. In his place was a terrified, desperate man facing decades in federal prison. His defense attorney, a slick, expensive lawyer paid for by liquidating the last of Calvin's hidden assets, knew they had absolutely no legitimate case. The paper trail was completely undeniable. The wire transfers were entirely solid. So they decided to go with a strategy of absolute pure desperation. They were going to try to pin the entire massive fraud operation on me. The defense attorney stood before the jury and spun a wild, fantastical story. He pointed his finger directly at me, sitting quietly in the gallery. He called me a criminal mastermind. He told the jury that I was a bitter, jealous spinster who resented my beautiful younger sister and her perfect marriage. He claimed that because I secretly owned a massive real estate and technology corporation, I possessed the immense digital skills and financial power necessary to hack into church servers, manipulate routing numbers, and frame my innocent brother-in-law. It was a narrative built entirely on absolute delusion, but Preston was desperate enough to try anything. To support this ridiculous fairy tale, the defense called my mother to the stand. Brenda walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, wearing a modest beige dress she had clearly bought from a discount store. She took the oath and sat in the witness box, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. She immediately launched into the greatest theatrical performance of her entire life. She looked at the jury and told them I had always been unstable. She claimed I harbored a deep, vicious jealousy toward Whitney since childhood. Brenda wept fake tears as she swore under oath that she had personally witnessed me threatening to destroy Preston's life. She told the court that Preston was a good, honest man who had only ever tried to help our family grow our meager savings. She painted me as a cold, calculating monster who used my hidden wealth to crush anyone who got in my way. I sat there listening to the woman who gave birth to me lie under oath to protect a con artist. Years ago, her betrayal would have shattered my heart into a million pieces. Today, it simply validated every single choice I had made to protect myself. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. When Brenda stepped down, it was Whitney's turn. My sister waddled up to the witness stand, her massive pregnant belly preceding her. She wore a maternity dress that was meant to make her look innocent and vulnerable. She swore to tell the truth, and then immediately began to lie with the exact same venomous energy she had used her entire life. Whitney told the jury that Preston was a devoted husband and a brilliant financial mind. She sobbed dramatically, gripping her stomach as she described how I had cruelly ambushed them at my decoy house. She twisted the truth, claiming I had hired a locksmith to lock them out of their own property just to be vicious. She told the court that I had openly bragged about hacking the church accounts just to ruin her perfect family. She begged the jury to see that Preston was completely innocent, and that I was the one who belonged in a federal prison cell. Preston sat at the defense table, nodding along with tears in his eyes, playing the role of the wrongfully accused family man. The jury looked sympathetic. Whitney's performance was incredibly compelling if you did not know she was a pathological liar. Then my lead attorney Marcus stood up for the cross-examination. Marcus was a legendary litigator who possessed a mind like a steel trap. He walked slowly to the center of the courtroom, holding a thick black folder. He did not yell. He did not look angry. He just looked mildly amused. Marcus began by addressing Whitney's claims about the audio recording from the church gala. Whitney had sworn that I digitally fabricated the recording using advanced software to mimic Preston's voice. Marcus asked the judge for permission to play the full, unedited audio file obtained directly from the church's secure servers. The judge agreed. The courtroom went dead silent as Preston's voice echoed through the massive speakers. But this time it was not just the snippet I had played at the gala, it was the entire hour-long recording. The jury heard Preston actively mocking Calvin. They heard him laughing about how easy it was to steal from an elderly congregation. They heard him explicitly stating that he was using his privilege to blind the church elders while he drained their accounts. It was vile and absolutely undeniable. Whitney shifted uncomfortably in the witness stand, her face flushing red. "That could have been generated by a computer," she stammered, clinging desperately to her script. "My sister owns a technology company. She could have made that." Marcus did not argue. He simply walked over to the evidence table and picked up a stack of heavy documents. He approached the witness stand and handed them to Whitney. He asked her to identify the papers. Whitney looked down at them, her hands shaking slightly. They were the mortgage documents Calvin had signed, the ones that surrendered his home to my holding company. "Are you aware, Mrs. Vance," Marcus asked, his voice ringing clear across the courtroom, "that digital forensics experts from the Federal Bureau of Investigation have traced the Internet Protocol address used to generate these fraudulent mortgage documents?" Whitney swallowed hard, looking over at Preston. "I do not know anything about that," she whispered. Marcus turned to the jury. "The federal agents traced the digital address directly to the primary computer terminal inside your husband's private office. The documents were created, printed, and digitally signed on a network that only Preston Vance had access to." My client Jordan Williams was in a board meeting across town at the exact moment these documents were generated. We have the building security footage and 30 sworn witness statements to prove it. Preston closed his eyes, dropping his head into his hands. His defense strategy was collapsing in real time. But Marcus was not finished. He was just getting started. He had completely destroyed their narrative about me being a criminal mastermind. Now he was going to destroy the very foundation of Whitney's delusional existence. Mrs. Vance, Marcus said, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. You have testified today that your husband is a devoted family man. You stated that he stole nothing and that his only goal was to build a beautiful life for you and your unborn child. Is that correct? Yes, Whitney said, her voice trembling but defiant. He loves me. He would do anything for our family. Marcus walked back to the evidence table and picked up a single thin folder. He pulled out a stack of bank statements and financial ledgers that had been heavily redacted by federal agents, but still showed the most crucial routing information. He handed the papers to the judge, then handed a copy to the defense attorney before approaching Whitney. If your husband was solely focused on providing for your family? Mrs. Vance, Marcus asked, his tone suddenly sharp and piercing. Can you explain why the $3 million stolen from the church building fund was not routed into your joint accounts? Can you explain why the money extracted from your father's fraudulent mortgage was never invested into your husband's business? Whitney stared at the papers, her brow furrowed in confusion. I do not understand, she muttered. Where did the money go? Marcus turned to face the entire courtroom, making sure his voice reached the very back row where Brenda and Calvin were sitting. The money was routed through a shell company in the islands and then deposited directly into a private bank account in Geneva, Switzerland, Marcus announced. The account does not belong to your husband, Mrs. Vance. It belongs to a woman named Elena Rostova. The courtroom erupted into a low, shocked murmur. Preston shot out of his chair, his face a mask of absolute panic. His lawyer scrambled to his feet, shouting an objection, claiming the information was highly prejudicial and irrelevant to the fraud charges. It goes directly to motive, Your Honor, the federal prosecutor interjected, standing up. The defense opened the door by claiming the defendant acted solely for the benefit of his family. We have the right to prove where the stolen funds actually went. The judge nodded, overruling the objection and instructing Marcus to proceed. Whitney was staring at the paper in her hands, her eyes wide and unblinking. Who is Elena? She whispered, the microphone picking up the fragile, terrified sound of her voice. Elena Rostova is a 24-year-old model living in Geneva. Marcus explained, his voice devoid of any pity. According to federal financial records, your husband has been paying the lease on her luxury penthouse for the last 18 months. He also used the funds stolen from your father's house to purchase a $2 million villa in the Swiss mountains under her name. The flight he was attempting to catch on the night of his arrest was a one-way ticket to Zurich. Marcus stepped closer to the witness stand, locking eyes with my sister. He was not planning to build a life with you, Mrs. Vance. He was stealing your family blind to fund a secret life with his mistress in Europe. He was going to leave you holding the bag while he lived in a mansion paid for by your father's bankruptcy. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. No one moved. No one breathed. Whitney sat completely frozen in the witness chair. The papers slipped from her trembling hands and fluttered to the wooden floor. She looked across the room at Preston. Preston could not even look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the defense table, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. He did not try to deny it. He did not try to shout that it was a lie. His silence was the most absolute, devastating confession possible. For 31 years, Whitney had believed she was the center of the universe. She had believed she was smarter, prettier, and more deserving than anyone else on earth. She had built her entire identity on the illusion of her perfect marriage and her wealthy, handsome husband. She had actively participated in my abuse because it made her feel superior. She had lied under oath just minutes ago to protect a man she thought worshipped her. And in a matter of seconds, it was all gone. Every single lie she had ever told herself was stripped away, leaving nothing but a humiliated, broken woman whose husband had used her family as a piggy bank to fund his life with a younger, more beautiful woman. Whitney let out a sound that I had never heard before. It was not a theatrical cry or a dramatic sob. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated agony. She doubled over in the witness chair, clutching her massive, pregnant belly, her face contorting in sheer physical pain. She tried to stand up, but her knees buckled instantly. She crashed back down into the heavy wooden chair, letting out a piercing, agonizing scream that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the courtroom. My baby Whitney screamed, her hands gripping the edges of the witness stand so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. Something is wrong. The pain. It hurts so much. Brenda jumped up from her seat in the gallery, screaming my sister's name. Calvin rushed forward, trying to push past the wooden partition, but a court bailiff immediately blocked his path. The entire courtroom descended into absolute chaos. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order, but the sound was completely drowned out by Whitney's terrified screams. She slid out of the witness chair, collapsing onto the floor. A dark, wet stain began to spread rapidly across the light fabric of her maternity dress. The immense psychological shock of the betrayal, combined with the intense stress of the trial, had triggered a massive physical reaction. Her water had just broken right there on the floor of the federal courtroom. She was going into premature labor. "Call an ambulance," the judge shouted, pointing at the bailiff. "Clear the courtroom. Everyone out right now." Federal marshals rushed forward, surrounding Preston and physically pulling him away from the defense table to secure him in holding. He craned his neck, trying to look back at Whitney, but the agents marched him out through the side door without a shred of hesitation. Medical personnel from the courthouse clinic burst through the double doors, running down the center aisle with a trauma kit. I stood up from my seat in the front row, perfectly calm, amidst the absolute hurricane of panic and destruction. I watched Brenda sobbing hysterically on her knees next to Whitney, holding her hand as my sister screamed in agony. Calvin stood nearby, looking completely useless and entirely broken. Their perfect family was literally bleeding out on the floor of a federal courthouse. Marcus stepped up beside me quietly, packing his documents back into his black folder. "We are done here," he said, his voice steady and calm. "Yes, we are," I replied, smoothing the front of my suit jacket. I turned my back on the screaming, the crying, and the ruins of the Williams family. I walked out of the courtroom, my head held high, the sound of my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor, leaving them to face the absolute devastating reality they had built for themselves. The news of what happened next reached me later that evening through Marcus. Whitney was rushed directly from the courtroom floor to the emergency ward of the nearest hospital. She gave birth to her 7th child, a boy, amidst the complete and total collapse of her universe. There were no joyful grandparents passing out cigars in the waiting room. There was no wealthy husband holding her hand and telling her everything would be fine. Preston was locked in a federal holding cell wearing an orange jumpsuit. The bail hearing the next morning was swift and brutally efficient. The judge deemed him a massive flight risk, especially given the one-way ticket to Zurich and the mistress waiting in a purchased Swiss villa. Bail was denied completely. He was remanded to federal custody, facing a mandatory minimum of 15 years. The seizure of their assets was absolute and unforgiving. The federal government froze every single account connected to Preston and Whitney. The massive mansion in the gated community was padlocked by the bank. The luxury cars were towed away on flatbeds while their former neighbors watched from their manicured lawns. Whitney was officially a single mother of 7 children, with absolutely zero income, no assets, and a husband who was never coming home. I spent the next 3 days in the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse. It was an $8 million architectural masterpiece suspended high above the city skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the world I had conquered. I had designed every inch of it myself, filling the space with modern art, imported marble, and quiet elegance. It was a fortress of peace built on the foundation of my own relentless hard work and my reclaimed inheritance. I was sitting on my velvet sofa sipping black coffee when the security intercom chimed. The concierge sounded deeply uncomfortable. He told me there were 3 people in the lobby claiming to be my family, and they were refusing to leave the premises. "Send them up," I said, setting my coffee cup down on the glass table. I stood by the massive marble kitchen island, waiting as the private elevator hummed its way up to my top floor. When the brass doors finally slid open, the sight that greeted me was almost difficult to comprehend. 31 years of arrogant supremacy had been reduced to a pathetic, shivering huddle. Calvin, Brenda, and Whitney stepped off the elevator into my foyer. They were not wearing their designer clothes or their smug expressions. They were carrying heavy black trash bags filled with whatever garments they had managed to frantically stuff inside before the federal agents locked them out of their properties. Whitney was holding her newborn infant wrapped in a cheap hospital blanket. Her other 6 children were apparently being watched by a distant cousin who had reluctantly taken pity on them for the afternoon. Brenda took one look at the sprawling, immaculate penthouse and burst into fresh tears. She dropped her trash bag onto the polished hardwood floor and stumbled forward. "Jordan," she wept, her hands clasped together in front of her chest. "Jordan, please, we have nowhere else to go. The banks took everything. The government took the rest. All of our friends from the club blocked our numbers. We slept in Calvin's old sedan last night. It was freezing. You have to take us in. Look at all this room. You have so much space, you cannot turn away your own mother." I looked at her tear-stained face, feeling absolutely no urge to comfort her. "You are not staying here," I said, my voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. "This is my home. You are not going to infect it with your toxic presence." Calvin stepped forward, his shoulders hunched. He looked like an old, defeated man stripped of his country club memberships and his fake authority. "Jordan," he rasped, staring at the marble floor. "We are begging you. Whitney just had a baby. Preston is gone. We have absolutely nothing left. You won. You proved your point. Now please, just be the bigger person and help your family." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "Be the bigger person. That is exactly what you always demanded of me whenever you treated me like dirt. You stole my inheritance. You forged medical documents to label me insane. You funded a criminal's lavish lifestyle with my grandfather's money while I scrubbed floors and slept on couches. And now that you are facing the absolute ruin you built with your own hands, you want me to be the bigger person. The answer is no. You can take your trash bags and go find a homeless shelter." Whitney, who had been standing silently shivering with her newborn, suddenly snapped. The fragile delusion she had maintained her entire life shattered into a million jagged pieces right there in my foyer. She let out a guttural scream that startled the baby, causing it to wail loudly. "You ruined my life!" Whitney shrieked, her face turning a blotchy, violent red. "You took everything from me!" "I did not take anything, Whitney," I replied calmly, crossing my arms. "Preston took it. Your husband stole it to give to his 24-year-old mistress in Europe." Whitney shook her head violently, tears flying from her face. "No," she screamed, her voice cracking into a raw, desperate wail. "It is your fault because you always made us look bad. You were always so quiet and independent. We hated you. We hated you because you never needed us. You never begged for Mom and Dad's approval like I did." She took a step toward me, clutching the crying infant to her chest, her eyes wild and bloodshot. "Do you know how exhausting it was?" She sobbed, her voice breaking into a pathetic, frantic whine. "I had to be the perfect one. I had to marry the rich guy. I had to keep having kids to keep them paying attention to me. 7 kids, Jordan. 7. I did not even want this many. But every time I got pregnant, Mom and Dad would look at me like I was special again. I traded my entire body and my entire life just to be their favorite." Whitney gasped for air, swaying slightly on her feet as the ugly truth spilled out of her. "And you?" she cried, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You just walked away. You did not care about their praise. You just quietly went out and became everything I could never be. You built a real empire while I was trapped in a fake one. I hate you for being strong enough to not need them." Her confession echoed through the massive penthouse, lingering in the air like poison. Brenda and Calvin stared at their golden child in absolute horrified silence. They finally heard the pathetic, twisted reality of the dynamic they had created. They had bred a monster of insecurity and narcissism, and now they were chained to her and her 7 children forever. They had destroyed my youth to build a fake throne for a daughter who secretly resented them for it. I looked at the three of them standing there, surrounded by their garbage bags, weeping in the foyer of the empire they tried to deny me. They were a portrait of ultimate absolute defeat. I did not feel pity. I did not feel rage. I felt completely, entirely finished with them. The chapter of my life where they held any power over me was officially closed. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I had memorized, keeping my eyes locked on their terrified, anticipating faces. They held their breath, waiting to see what I would do next. The line connected on the first ring. "It is time," I said, my voice echoing like ice through the room. "Execute the final phase." "Execute the final phase," I said into my phone before ending the call and sliding the sleek device back into my tailored pocket. My parents and my sister stared at me, their tear-stained faces suddenly shifting from absolute despair to a pathetic glimmer of hope. They genuinely believed that because I made a single phone call, I was summoning my massive wealth to save them. They thought the old Jordan, the one they had conditioned and beaten down to serve them, was finally surfacing to clean up their massive catastrophic mess. They stood in my immaculate marble foyer, surrounded by their black plastic trash bags waiting for their salvation. Less than 10 minutes later, the private elevator hummed to life again. The polished brass doors slid open and Marcus stepped out carrying a thick stack of heavy manila folders. He did not look at my parents or my sister. He walked straight past their shivering, huddled forms to the massive kitchen island and set the legal documents down, spreading them out in a neat, precise row. "You wanted a place to stay," I said, walking over to the marble island and tapping the first printed document. "I am not a monster. I will not let 7 innocent children sleep in a freezing car because their mother and grandparents are corrupt, incompetent criminals. I own a residential building on the far industrial side of the city. It is a modest 3-bedroom apartment with beige walls and cheap linoleum floors. It is completely safe, but it is absolutely nothing like the sprawling mansions you are used to. I have drafted a standard 1-year lease for you." Brenda let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief, clutching her chest as if she had just survived a war. "Oh, Jordan, thank you," she wept, stepping forward and reaching out as if to hug me. "I knew you would not abandon your blood. We will need a larger allowance for groceries, of course, with the new baby, and Whitney needs new clothes since the bank locked us out of the house before she could pack her maternity wear." "You are not getting an allowance, Brenda," I said, my voice slicing through her delusion like a razor blade. I stepped back, refusing to let her touch me. "You are going to pay rent. Every single month on the first of the month, just like every other working-class family in this country. And you are going to pay it with the wages you earn from the jobs my legal team has secured for you today." Calvin stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. "What jobs?" he finally managed to ask, his voice rough and terrified. I pulled out 3 employment contracts and lined them up next to the lease. "Calvin, you are going to be the new morning greeter at the local hardware store, 2 blocks from your new apartment. You will stand on your feet for 8 hours a day, handing out shopping carts and smiling at people who actually work for a living. You will wear a bright orange vest, and you will clock in at 6 in the morning. Brenda, you will be watching Whitney's 7 children while she works, because your social climbing days are permanently over." The church board held an emergency meeting this morning. They have officially banned you for life due to your involvement in the wire fraud scandal. You are a complete pariah in your own community. You have absolutely no friends left. Whitney clutched her newborn infant tighter to her chest, her eyes darting wildly around the room. "What about me?" she asked, her voice trembling with rising panic. "What am I supposed to do, Jordan?" I pushed the final employment contract across the cold marble counter. "You are going to get your very first real job, Whitney. You are going to be a commercial cleaning associate for my property management firm. You will wear a uniform, you will clock in at midnight, and you will scrub toilets, empty trash cans, and mop the floors of the exact same office buildings you used to walk past in your expensive designer shoes. You will scrub floors to feed your 7 children, just like I scrubbed floors while you stole my inheritance." Whitney stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake about to strike her. "I cannot clean toilets," she screamed, her voice shrill and panicked, echoing off the high ceilings. I am a mother. I am a Vance. I do not know how to mop floors or empty garbage cans. I have never done manual labor in my entire life. You will learn. I told her, my expression completely blank. Or you and your 7 children will be evicted onto the street. Those are the absolute final terms. You either sign these documents right now, or you pick up your trash bags and walk back out to the elevator. The choice is entirely yours. They had absolutely no leverage, and they knew it. They were entirely trapped by the consequences of their own horrific greed. One by one, they shuffled up to the marble island, like prisoners walking to the gallows. Calvin signed first, his hand shaking so badly he could barely form the letters of his own name. Brenda signed next, weeping silently, her heavy tears falling onto the crisp white lease agreement. Finally, Whitney signed, dropping her pen and sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. They had traded their stolen empire for a mop, a hardware store vest, and a minimum wage paycheck. Marcus stepped forward, gathering the signed contracts and handing Calvin a separate small manila envelope. Inside that envelope are the keys to the apartment and your official severance documents, I explained, watching them clutch the tiny packet of paper. My legal team has completely and permanently severed any financial ties between us. I am legally protected from any of your debts, your pending bankruptcies, or your future legal fees. I am completely insulated from the radioactive disaster of your lives. You cannot use my name to secure loans, and you cannot list me as an emergency contact. I instructed my security team to escort them out of the building and drive them to their new reality. I followed them in a separate car simply to watch the absolute conclusion of their downfall. When we arrived at the cramped apartment building on the industrial side of town, they piled out of the security vehicle, dragging their heavy black trash bags up the concrete stairs. I stood in the doorway of the small 3-bedroom unit, watching them take in the cheap linoleum, the stained kitchen cabinets, and the single tiny bathroom meant for 10 people. They did not even wait 5 minutes before they started tearing each other apart. Whitney screamed at Calvin for losing their money and trusting Preston. Calvin shouted at Brenda for spoiling Whitney and making her completely useless. Brenda cried and blamed Preston for everything, refusing to take accountability for her own forged documents. They were a miserable, toxic ecosystem of blame and resentment, and they were going to be trapped in this tiny box together for the rest of their miserable lives. I stood in the doorway and pulled my phone from my pocket. I removed the SIM card, snapped it in half, and dropped the broken plastic pieces into the trash can by the door. I am changing my phone number, I said, my voice cutting through their endless bickering. They stopped shouting and turned to look at me. This is the absolute last time you will ever see my face or hear my voice. Do not try to find me. Do not try to contact me. You are officially, legally, and emotionally dead to me. I turned my back on them and walked down the concrete stairs. Behind me, I could hear the echo of Whitney's desperate sobbing and Calvin's exhausted shouting, but the sound grew fainter with every single step I took. I stepped out into the crisp evening air and got into my waiting car. The physical sensation of relief was absolutely overwhelming. It felt as though an invisible, crushing weight had been permanently lifted from my chest. 31 years of generational trauma had finally been severed completely. 3 months later, the atmosphere in my $8 million penthouse was entirely different. The cold, sterile silence of the past had been completely replaced by the warm, glowing energy of genuine love and celebration. Soft jazz played through the hidden speakers, and the rich smell of roasted garlic and expensive wine filled the air. I was hosting a private dinner party at my massive dining table, but the guest list was absolutely nothing like the toxic performative gatherings my parents used to force upon me. Marcus sat at the head of the table, laughing loudly as he told a story about our latest highly successful corporate acquisition. My incredible legal team sat across from him, sharing a bottle of vintage red wine and trading stories about their families. Beside me sat Daniel, my supportive, brilliant partner, who loved me for my mind and my resilience, not for my bank account. He reached under the table and squeezed my hand, his eyes shining with absolute genuine pride. We were surrounded by my true chosen family. My mentors, my loyal friends, the people who had stood by me when I was nothing but a broken girl sleeping on a second-hand couch. There was no judgment at this table. There were no backhanded compliments, no subtle manipulations, no desperate pathetic pleas for conditional approval. There was only mutual respect and authentic, unwavering support. I looked around the room, taking in the beautiful life I had built entirely from the ashes of my destruction. I had survived their relentless cruelty. I had outsmarted their massive greed. I had reclaimed every single piece of my stolen future and built an empire that no one could ever take away from me. Daniel leaned over and kissed my cheek, handing me a fresh glass of wine. I stood up from my chair and the table went perfectly quiet. My friends and mentors looked at me with warm, expectant smiles. I raised my glass of wine and looked out at the glittering city skyline spreading across the horizon through the floor-to-ceiling windows. They wanted me to be the help to clean up the messes of the golden child. But they forgot one thing. When you spend your whole life at the bottom, you learn exactly how to dismantle the foundation. I did not just break the generational curse. I bought the building, evicted the toxicity, and kept the keys. True family is not determined by blood, but by who respects and supports you unconditionally, when the people who should protect you become your greatest source of pain. Walking away is not a failure, it is an act of ultimate self-preservation. You do not owe your success or peace to toxic relatives who only value you for what they can extract from you. Building an empire from the ashes of betrayal proves your worth is never defined by their approval. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members? Share your story in the comments below. Subscribe.